For years, I believed I knew exactly where I stood in my own life. I built systems that worked. I trusted routines that never surprised me, and I surrounded myself with people who stayed exactly where I needed them to be. That illusion cracked on an ordinary weekday afternoon, not because of betrayal, not because of loss, but because someone I depended on calmly stepped outside the role I had assigned them. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, almost polite. And yet, in that small moment, something inside me shifted. A realization I had spent years avoiding rose to the surface. That competence can feel like intimacy, that distance can disguise attachment, and that sometimes the most unsettling truths arrive without warning, spoken plainly by someone who never meant to disrupt your world at all. This isn't a story about romance. It's a story about control, and what happens when it slips, just long enough for the truth to breathe. Have you ever realized too late that someone mattered to you long before you admitted it to yourself? By the time the afternoon light began to tilt toward evening, I had already decided the day was finished. Not because the work was done, it never truly was, but because the rhythm had settled, meetings concluded, calls returned, decisions made and documented. The familiar hum of order restored itself around me, just the way I preferred. Outside my office, Daniel Mercer sat at his desk, exactly where he had been since 8:30 that morning. He always arrived before I did. He always left after everything was secure. For nearly 4 years, that had been the arrangement. Daniel's workspace was immaculate without feeling sterile. One monitor, aligned precisely. A slim planner open to the correct date. A ceramic mug, chipped at the rim, positioned slightly to the left of his keyboard. No clutter, no excess, nothing that suggested distraction. I trusted that desk more than most people. He filtered interruptions before they reached me, anticipated complications before I noticed them forming, managed the undercurrent of a company that employed hundreds, without ever inserting himself into the spotlight. If I forgot a detail, Daniel remembered it. If I hesitated, Daniel waited. If I pushed too hard, Daniel gently steadied the pace. He never corrected me in front of others. Never lingered when I needed silence. Never crossed a line I hadn't drawn. That, more than anything, was why he worked. At least, that's what I told myself. Late afternoon had softened the edges of the office. The glass walls reflected amber light instead of steel. I leaned back in my chair, allowed myself a brief exhale, and glanced toward the doorway. "Send the revised timeline to legal," I said, "and reschedule the vendor call for Monday." Daniel nodded, already typing. "Done." His voice was even, neutral. The same tone he used whether he was confirming a calendar invite or diffusing a crisis. I gathered a few documents into a neat stack, expecting the quiet continuation of the day. Then he checked his watch. Practically nothing, but it registered. Daniel never checked the time unless something mattered. "I'll need to leave a bit early today," he said. The words settled strangely in the room. I looked up, frowning slightly. "Is everything all right?" "Yes." He closed the planner, slid it into his bag. "Everything's fine." That was when the stillness sharpened. Daniel didn't stand before I did. He didn't pack up until the day was fully resolved. "Is there something urgent?" I asked, already scrolling through my mental list of contingencies. "No," he said calmly. "I've prepared everything for tomorrow. Nothing should require your attention this evening." There was no apology in his tone, no explanation volunteered, just certainty. "And the reason?" I asked. more out of habit than insistence. He met my gaze then, not defensively, not nervously, just directly. "I have plans." Plans. The words struck with unexpected weight. I waited, assuming he would elaborate. "A family obligation, a health appointment, something practical." He didn't. For the first time since he joined the company, Daniel Mercer had offered me a boundary without cushioning it. "I see," I said, though I didn't. He lifted his jacket from the back of his chair, folding it over his arm with practiced care. "I'll be reachable if something urgent comes up," he added, as if reading my thoughts. "But I don't anticipate it will." He was right. He almost always was. Still, something tightened in my chest. Not irritation, not anger, displacement. Daniel moved toward the door, unhurried, as if this were the most natural conclusion to the day. And that was when I realized something unsettling. I didn't know where he was going. In 4 years, I knew his efficiency metrics, his response times, his professional history, down to the month. I knew how he took his coffee. I knew which board members tested his patience. I knew exactly when to trust his silence. But I had never asked where he went when he left. "Daniel," I said. He paused, hand resting lightly against the doorframe. "Yes?" The word lingered in my throat, undefined. I wasn't sure what I meant to ask. Only that letting him leave, without acknowledging the moment, felt wrong. "You don't usually—" I stopped myself. He waited. "I wasn't aware you had personal commitments during the week," I finished. There it was. Neat, professional, safely impersonal. He studied me for a moment, expression unreadable. Not defensive, not amused. "I do," he said simply. "I've just been careful not to let them interfere with work." That should have reassured me. Instead, it exposed something I hadn't meant to see. That his restraint had been a choice, not an absence. "I'll see you tomorrow," he added, and then he stepped out of my office. The door closed softly behind him. I remained seated, hands folded, posture unchanged. Nothing in the room was out of order. Nothing had gone wrong. And yet, the air felt different, like a system recalibrating without my consent. I stared at the space where Daniel's desk was visible through the glass. Empty. For the first time in years, I couldn't tell myself why that unsettled me so deeply. What happens when someone you rely on quietly reminds you they exist beyond your control? The building grew quieter after he left. That wasn't unusual. By late afternoon, most of the upper floors thinned out. Conversations replaced by the soft echo of footsteps and the hum of climate control systems adjusting for the night. I had spent years working through that quiet, finding comfort in it. But this time, the silence pressed differently. I remained at my desk longer than necessary, scanning documents I had already reviewed, responding to emails that could have waited until morning. I told myself it was focus, discipline, the same habits that had carried me this far. Still, my eyes drifted toward the glass wall more often than I cared to admit. Daniel's desk sat empty, the monitor dark, chair tucked in neatly. He had left no trace of disruption, no mess, no unfinished task. Even his mug was gone. It irritated me more than if he had forgotten it. At 6 o'clock, I stood. I rarely left before night fully settled, but something about remaining felt unnecessary now, like staying behind after a conversation had already ended. As I stepped into the hallway, the motion sensor lights flickered on one by one, illuminating a path that felt longer than usual. My heels echoed sharply against the floor, each step reinforcing the fact that I was alone. I passed Daniel's desk. There was nothing there I hadn't seen before. the same precise alignment, the same restraint. Yet without him, the space felt less like an extension of function and more like an absence waiting to be acknowledged. I moved on. The elevator ride down was uneventful, but my reflection in the mirrored doors caught my attention. I looked composed, controlled, exactly as I always did. And yet, beneath that familiarity, something restless stirred. Outside, the evening air was cool, the city settling into its night rhythm. I walked toward my car, keys already in hand, my mind replaying the moment he checked his watch. I told myself it was nothing. Daniel had a life. I had simply never needed to consider it before. That realization landed heavier than I expected. During the drive home, I found myself distracted by trivial thoughts. What kind of plans required leaving early on a weekday? Whether this had happened before and I'd simply failed to notice. Why the idea unsettled me at all. The answers refused to organize themselves neatly. At home, the house greeted me with its usual stillness. Clean lines, neutral tones, a space designed for recovery, not warmth. I set my bag down, removed my shoes, and moved through the rooms out of habit rather than need. I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, staring out into the darkened yard. This was the life I had built deliberately. No interruptions, no surprises, no dependencies that couldn't be managed. So why did one deviation feel like a fault line? I slept poorly that night. Not because of anxiety exactly, but because my thoughts refused to settle. Each time I drifted toward rest, an image surfaced uninvited. Daniel standing calmly in my doorway, jacket over his arm, explaining nothing because he didn't owe me an explanation. By morning, I was already awake. I arrived at the office early, earlier than usual, the sky still pale with the promise of daylight. I told myself it was preparation. A full agenda awaited, and momentum mattered. Still, when the elevator doors opened onto my floor, my eyes went immediately to his desk. Empty. The clock read 8:17. I sat in my office reviewing reports, responding to messages, re-establishing the cadence of control. By the time Daniel arrived at 8:29, I had nearly convinced myself the previous afternoon had been inconsequential. He entered as he always did, quietly, efficiently, greeting me with a brief nod through the glass. "Good morning," he said, when he stepped into my office moments later. "Good morning," I replied, my voice even. He looked the same, composed, attentive, entirely unchanged. And yet something between us had shifted. "I've already reviewed the overnight updates," he continued. "There's nothing urgent, but legal flagged a minor concern we'll want to address before Thursday." I listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. It all functioned as it should. But beneath the professionalism, awareness lingered. I was seeing him differently now, not as an extension of my workflow, but as someone who moved independently of it. When he finished, he paused, as if considering something. "Yes?" I prompted. He hesitated only briefly. "Yesterday, I hope leaving early didn't create any inconvenience." There it was, an opening I hadn't expected. "It didn't," I said, truthfully. "Everything was handled." He nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good." He turned to leave, then stopped again. "If there's ever a concern about scheduling," he added, measured and respectful, "I'm always open to discussing it." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was a boundary, clearly drawn, calmly offered. "I appreciate that," I said. He left the office, returning to his desk. I sat back in my chair, staring at the closed door. That was when the truth settled uncomfortably into place. This wasn't about logistics. It was about the realization that I had grown accustomed to someone's presence without acknowledging their autonomy. I had mistaken consistency for permanence, and now that illusion was gone. The day progressed, filled with meetings and decisions, and carefully structured exchanges. Daniel performed his role flawlessly, as always. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, less tightly wound than usual. I wondered if I imagined that. At 5:30, he packed up, exactly on schedule. No watch this time, no announcement, just routine. And yet, as he stepped away from his desk, I felt the same quiet awareness settle in my chest. I watched him leave through the glass, my reflection overlaying his retreating form. For the first time, I understood something I had long avoided naming. I didn't miss his efficiency. I missed the certainty of his presence. And that knowledge unsettled me far more than his absence ever could. When someone steps back without explanation, do you confront the absence or pretend nothing changed? The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual, as though by arriving first, I could somehow reclaim control over the unsettled feelings Daniel's early departure had stirred in me. The building was quiet, hallways dim, except for the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights awakening as I passed. I moved through the office with purpose, opening files, reviewing schedules, scanning emails. All of it was familiar, the rhythm I had built over years. And yet, even as I moved, my thoughts returned repeatedly to the previous afternoon. Daniel's calm composure, the way he left without explanation, the casual mention of a date that wasn't a date at all, but a moment in his life I had never considered. It shouldn't have affected me. I knew that. I had always been careful not to let personal feelings interfere with judgment. But there it was, a flutter in my chest I could neither name nor dismiss. By the time he arrived, I had convinced myself I was composed. My reflection in the glass partitions confirmed it. Shoulders squared, spine straight, expression neutral. The moment he walked in, however, the taut calm of my posture felt less significant. "Good morning," he said, quietly efficient, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored jacket. "Good morning," I replied, voice steady, betraying nothing of the unease in my chest. "But when someone silently changes the rhythm of your world, do you notice or pretend it's nothing?" He settled at his desk, methodically setting up his monitor and notes. But for a fleeting second, his eyes met mine. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation, a subtle acknowledgement that yesterday had been different. And though it lasted no more than a heartbeat, it was enough to remind me that even the most controlled environments could be disrupted. Meetings passed, calls were returned, schedules adjusted, and the usual ebb of the office continued around us. Daniel performed flawlessly, as always, navigating interruptions with the ease of someone who had anticipated every possibility. And yet, the absence of yesterday's routine, the small cues I had subconsciously relied on, left a space I could not fill. I found myself glancing at his empty chair during a conference call, noticing how the sunlight caught the edge of his desk, imagining the precise angle his coffee mug would have been tilted, the way his hand rested on the mouse. By noon, I realized I was holding my breath every time someone mentioned lunch plans or personal errands. I was aware of his presence, not in the tasks he completed, but in the silence he had left behind. It was disorienting. During a brief pause between calls, I allowed myself to stand and walk to the window, hands loosely clasped in front of me. The city stretched beyond, faceless and distant. Traffic moved in patterns I could predict. People below were rushing through their routines, oblivious to the subtleties of my unease. I thought about the dinner, about the way he had looked at me, that faint smile lingering just long enough to unsettle me completely. About Ethan, so full of life, so curious, so unafraid to voice what he wanted. I realized with an unsettling clarity that Daniel's world existed beyond the boundaries I had imagined. I had been present in one part of it, but never the whole. I returned to my desk with a quiet acknowledgement. My assumptions had been my own. I had interpreted consistency as familiarity, presence as invitation, and I had been wrong. By mid-afternoon, I noticed subtle shifts in myself I hadn't anticipated. The urge to speak, truly speak, lingered. I wanted to acknowledge the absence, to recognize what I had failed to see. But I reminded myself, carefully, that restraint had served me well for decades. There was power in observation, in patience, in waiting for the right moment. Still, the awareness gnawed quietly. A notification blinked on my phone. An email from Daniel. Please review the attached agenda before tomorrow. Minor changes noted. Efficient, precise, professional. Nothing personal. And yet, in that clarity, I understood that his world functioned without needing my oversight. He managed the spaces I did not inhabit, and he did so effortlessly. I realized something deeper. I had always assumed control over what I could observe, and I had never accounted for what existed beyond my sight. The recognition left a strange tension in my chest, a combination of relief, humility, and desire I could neither name nor dismiss. By the time the clock read 5:15, I was aware of how slow the minutes had passed. My attention wandered to the faint sounds of traffic below, the distant hum of HVAC systems, the quiet clicking of keyboards in near-empty offices. I was present in the usual environment, but my mind had shifted to the unpredictable spaces of someone else's life. When Daniel stood to leave at precisely 5:30, he moved with the same calm assurance that had marked every departure in the past. But this time, the emptiness he left behind felt tangible. I watched him pass through the doorway, shoulders squared, jacket over his arm, a quiet grace in every motion. The space he occupied now felt suspended, waiting for acknowledgement. I realized without any dramatic confrontation that my perception of him had changed. He was no longer a part of the structure I relied on. He existed independently, in ways I had never considered, in a life that was parallel to mine but not bound by it. For the first time, I understood the subtle tension of desire and restraint, admiration and distance. I understood that acknowledgement, not interference, was often the truest expression of care. As the office emptied, I remained for a few more minutes, absorbing the residual presence he left behind. There was no need for conversation, no expectation of revelation. The silence spoke clearly: respect, awareness, and an unspoken connection. I packed up slowly, hands deliberately, savoring the ordinary motions that had always brought me comfort. The hallway felt longer on the return walk, but not in a way that caused panic. Rather, it impressed upon me the expansiveness of perspective I had yet to claim. Outside, the evening air was cooler than expected. I inhaled deeply, allowing it to fill the spaces Daniel had left behind. It was no longer absence. It was potential. As I drove home, the city lights blurred past, mundane in appearance but layered with significance. Every street lamp, every passing car seemed to reflect the quiet shifts occurring in my understanding. I was no longer merely the observer of efficiency. I was witnessing presence, its autonomy, its subtleties, its influence on my own perception. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was aware of a single certainty. My world had expanded, imperceptibly but irrevocably. The tension between control and surrender, between observation and acknowledgement, had found new balance. And somewhere in that balance, I understood that what had changed was not just him. The following days settled into a pattern that felt deceptively unchanged. The same meetings, the same schedules, the same precise coordination that had defined our working rhythm for years. And yet, beneath the surface, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no confessions, no awkward silences that demanded explanation. The change lived in the margins, in the pauses between sentences, in the way my attention lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, in the quiet awareness of Daniel's presence even when he was not in the room. On Wednesday morning, I arrived to find the office already awake. Sunlight spilled across the floor in narrow bands, illuminating dust particles drifting lazily in the air. Daniel was seated at his desk, reviewing documents with the same steady concentration he always carried. "Good morning," I said. He looked up, meeting my gaze with calm familiarity. "Good morning." Nothing else followed. No acknowledgement of the previous days. No reference to the shift I felt so acutely. But the absence of commentary did not erase the awareness. If anything, it sharpened it. We worked in parallel silence for most of the morning. Phones rang, emails were sent, decisions made. I watched him navigate interruptions with effortless competence, his voice measured, his expressions controlled. Yet I noticed the small details more than before. The slight furrow of his brow when concentrating, the way he paused before responding, as if weighing not just words, but implications. At one point, he stood to bring me a folder. His steps were unhurried, deliberate. He placed the file gently on my desk, his hand lingering just long enough to register the warmth of proximity. "Updated figures," he said. "Thank you." Our eyes met briefly. There was no tension in the traditional sense, no rush of emotion or dramatic spark, but there was something steadier, quieter, recognition. As he returned to his desk, I realized how aware I had become of the space between us. It wasn't distance, it was consideration. The acknowledgement that each of us occupied separate worlds that occasionally intersected, without obligation or assumption. Later that afternoon, I found myself reflecting on how often I had mistaken predictability for intimacy. Daniel had always been present, always reliable. And in that consistency, I had unconsciously allowed him to become part of my internal landscape without ever questioning whether he had chosen that role or whether I had assigned it to him. The realization wasn't uncomfortable. It was clarifying. During a break between meetings, I stepped into the hallway, carrying a cup of tea I no longer remembered making. The corridor was quiet, its polished floors reflecting the muted light. I leaned against the wall, letting the stillness settle around me. I thought about how rarely I allowed myself to notice change unless it demanded attention. This shift did not demand, it simply existed. When I returned to my office, Daniel was waiting with a list of updates. His posture was relaxed, his expression attentive but neutral. We reviewed details efficiently. Our conversation clipped, but seamless. "You've adjusted the timeline," I observed. "It allows more flexibility if the board requests revisions." I nodded. "Good call." A faint smile crossed his face. Not pride, not relief, just quiet acknowledgement. And in that moment, I felt something settle into place. Respect, unburdened by assumption. As the week progressed, I noticed how often I listened more carefully, not just to Daniel, but to myself, my reactions, my expectations, the subtle habits I had built over years of control. I realized that part of my unease had come not from his independence, but from my own reluctance to allow space for it. On Friday evening, as the office emptied earlier than usual, Daniel gathered his things with unremarkable calm. "Have a good weekend," he said. "You too," I replied, He paused at the doorway, as though considering something. Then he nodded once and left. I remained seated, hands folded, aware of the silence he left behind. But this time, it did not feel like absence. It felt like acknowledgement of boundaries, of autonomy, of the quiet understanding that neither of us owed the other explanation. That night, at home, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the neighborhood settle into darkness. The quiet was familiar, comforting. Yet my thoughts returned, not with urgency, but with curiosity. What did it mean to notice someone without claiming them, to care without control, to allow significance without expectation? I realized that this was not a loss of structure, it was an expansion of it, a refinement. The following Monday arrived without ceremony, another week, another set of responsibilities. And yet, as I stepped into the office and exchanged a simple greeting with Daniel, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before. We worked well together, not because of habit, but because of choice. And in that choice, in that unspoken agreement to occupy the space between familiarity and distance with grace, I understood that something enduring had taken shape. Not romance, not dependency, but mutual recognition, quiet, respectful, and deeply human. The space between us no longer demanded definition. It simply existed. It was during a meeting I had attended countless times before that I became aware of how much attention I was paying to what remained unsaid. The agenda was familiar, the participants predictable, the discussion moving forward with the steady inevitability of routine. And yet, I found myself listening not just to the words spoken, but to the spaces between them. Daniel sat to my right, as he always did, his presence steady and unobtrusive. He contributed when necessary, deferred when appropriate, and maintained the same composed demeanor that had made him indispensable. But I noticed the restraint in his posture now, the deliberate way he avoided filling silence unless invited. It was not distance, it was consideration. As the meeting progressed, a junior executive raised a question that shifted the room's attention. It was minor, procedural, yet it lingered longer than expected. I felt Daniel's gaze briefly turn toward me, not seeking approval, but awareness. I answered calmly, my voice even, measured. The room moved on, but the moment stayed with me. Later, after the meeting had adjourned and the participants filtered out in clusters of polite conversation, I remained seated, reviewing my notes. Daniel waited quietly, as he often did, allowing me the space to conclude without interruption. When I finally looked up, I found him watching, not intrusively, but attentively. "Everything covered?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Thank you for staying." "Of course." He hesitated, as though weighing something internally, then continued, "If there's anything you'd like me to adjust before the next session, let me know." "I will." The exchange was simple, professional, and yet there was a clarity to it that felt newly intentional. As we walked back to our offices, the corridor felt quieter than usual. The building seemed to absorb sound, amplifying the soft rhythm of our footsteps. I became acutely aware of how rarely I allowed moments like this to exist without commentary or direction. At the door to my office, Daniel paused. "I'll send the revised outline this evening." "There's no rush," I replied. He nodded once, then moved on. I closed the door behind me and stood still for a moment, hands resting lightly on the desk. I felt no urgency to sit, no impulse to reach for my phone. Instead, I allowed the silence to settle. What struck me most was not the interaction itself, but how differently I experienced it. In the past, I might have analyzed it for efficiency or outcome. Now, I recognized it as something quieter, a mutual understanding that neither of us needed to fill the space with explanation. That evening, as I reviewed documents at home, I noticed how often my thoughts drifted, not toward him specifically, but toward the evolving shape of my own awareness. I was paying attention differently, listening differently, allowing moments to exist without resolving them. It was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. The next day brought an unexpected complication. A request from the board arrived late in the afternoon, requiring immediate attention. The timeline was tight, the expectations clear. I summoned Daniel to review the details. He entered promptly, carrying his notebook, his expression attentive. "They want revisions by morning," I said. He scanned the message, nodding. "It's possible, but it will require reprioritizing." "Do what you think is best," I replied. He looked up, meeting my eyes briefly. There was a subtle shift in his expression. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. "All right," he said. We worked quietly for the next hour, exchanging concise updates, coordinating without friction. I noticed how naturally we moved within this shared focus, each aware of the other's rhythm. There was no tension, no need to assert control. At one point, I realized how rarely I had trusted someone to manage complexity without oversight. The realization was humbling. When the revisions were complete, Daniel closed his notebook. "I'll send the final version tonight." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate it." He paused, then added, "I don't mind staying late." "I know," I replied. The words lingered between us, not as reassurance, but as recognition. As he left, I remained seated, aware of how much had been accomplished without a single conversation about boundaries, expectations, or change. We had adapted quietly, intuitively. That night I thought about how much meaning people often assign to declaration, how we believe clarity must be spoken aloud to be real. Yet here, in the absence of explicit discussion, something genuine had taken shape. It was not intimacy in the conventional sense. It was alignment. The following morning, the board approved the revisions without comment. The matter resolved itself cleanly, efficiently. Daniel acknowledged the outcome with a brief nod, returning immediately to his tasks. I watched him for a moment longer than necessary, not out of longing, but out of appreciation. It occurred to me then that some connections are defined not by what is shared, but by what is respected. The awareness settled gently. I returned to my work with a sense of quiet equilibrium, knowing that whatever unfolded next would not need to be forced. Some things I had learned reveal themselves best when left unspoken. The disruption did not arrive dramatically. It never did. Instead, it entered the way most meaningful changes do, quietly, without announcement, carried in the presence of someone unfamiliar. Her name was Margaret Hale, a consultant the board brought in for a short-term review. Experienced, articulate, precise. She arrived midweek with little ceremony, her schedule already integrated into mine before I had the opportunity to question it. She was efficient, observant, and unfailingly polite, the kind of person who noticed patterns quickly and spoke only when she had something considered to say. Daniel handled her onboarding with his usual ease. Introductions were brief, schedules aligned, expectations clarified. I watched the interaction from across the conference table, noting how naturally he adjusted his rhythm to accommodate her presence. It was not jealousy I felt. It was recognition. Margaret's observations were sharp, her questions thoughtful. She challenged assumptions without confrontation, reframing issues in a way that invited reflection rather than defense. I appreciated her immediately. As the week progressed, our meetings extended longer than anticipated. Conversations deepened, drifting beyond immediate objectives into broader considerations of leadership, structure, and long-term sustainability. Daniel remained attentive throughout, documenting points, managing time with subtle cues, ensuring discussions stayed grounded. But I noticed how Margaret occasionally addressed him directly, not for clarification, but for perspective. "How do you see this evolving?" she asked him once, mid-discussion. He considered before answering, as he always did. "Incrementally," he said. "Consistency matters more than speed here." She nodded, satisfied. "That aligns with my assessment." The exchange was brief, unremarkable, yet it stayed with me. I realized then how rarely I had witnessed Daniel's perspective being acknowledged independently of mine, not validated through my authority, but on its own merit. It was enlightening. Later that afternoon, Margaret and I spoke privately. She leaned back in her chair, hands folded, studying me with calm curiosity. "You have a strong team," she said. "Yes," I replied, "and a particularly capable second." I paused, then nodded. "He's been invaluable." She smiled faintly. "It shows." There was no implication in her tone, no suggestion beyond observation. And yet, the comment lingered longer than expected. When Daniel brought me the updated reports later that day, I thanked him and continued reviewing without comment. But my awareness had shifted again, not toward tension, but toward clarity. I was seeing him not through familiarity, but through reflection. How others perceived him. How he navigated space when he was not simply responding to me. That evening, as we prepared to leave, Margaret joined us in the hallway. "Productive day," she said pleasantly. "Indeed," I replied. She turned to Daniel. "You'll send me the revised datasets?" "Yes," he said. "By morning." "Excellent." She nodded once and departed, heels echoing softly against the polished floor. Daniel and I stood for a moment longer than necessary. It was contemplative. "She's perceptive," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Her feedback has been useful." I thought so too. The exchange ended there. No elaboration, no subtext. But the presence of another perspective had subtly altered the space we shared. At home that night, I found myself reflecting on how often clarity emerges through contrast. Margaret's arrival had not disrupted our dynamic. It had illuminated it. I understood then that what I valued most was not exclusivity, but balance, the ability to coexist within a structure that allowed autonomy, recognition, and mutual respect. The next day unfolded with quiet efficiency. Margaret continued her review, Daniel supported seamlessly, and I observed with renewed awareness. There was no tension between us, no sense of competition or displacement. Instead, there was something steadier, a shared understanding that significance did not require possession. As the week drew to a close, Margaret prepared to leave. She thanked us both, offering thoughtful parting remarks. "You've built something sustainable here," she said to me. "That's rare." Then, turning to Daniel, she added, "And you support it well." He acknowledged the comment with a nod, as always. When she was gone, the office felt quieter, not emptier, but restored to its familiar cadence. I returned to my desk, aware that something had been affirmed rather than challenged. The presence of another voice had not unsettled the balance we had found. It had reinforced it. Later that evening, as Daniel gathered his things, he paused briefly. "Let me know if there's anything else you need," he said. "I will," I replied. He left without hesitation. I remained seated, hands resting lightly on the desk, aware of the stillness around me. What had changed was subtle but undeniable. I no longer measured our connection by proximity or routine. I understood it now as something quieter, an alignment of respect, awareness, and choice. And in that understanding, I felt neither loss nor longing. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often unnoticed, when understanding settles without effort. It does not announce itself. It does not demand action. It simply becomes part of the way you move through the world. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The office was already awake when I arrived, the usual rhythm unfolding without interruption. Phones rang, printers hummed, conversations drifted through glass partitions in muted tones. Nothing was different, and yet I felt it immediately, a sense of calm that had not been present before. Daniel greeted me with a nod and a brief "good morning." "Good morning," I replied. The exchange required nothing more. We moved through the morning with practiced ease. I reviewed reports, made decisions, responded to questions. Daniel anticipated needs without prompting, adjusted timelines without drawing attention, ensured continuity without asserting presence. I noticed how little I questioned it now, not because it had become automatic again, but because I trusted it. Trust had replaced assumption. During a late morning break, I found myself alone in the conference room, reviewing notes for an upcoming strategy session. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, quiet shadows across the table. I closed my notebook and sat back, allowing myself a rare moment of stillness. I thought about the years that had shaped this place, decades of structure, discipline, careful restraint. I had learned early that clarity required boundaries, that leadership demanded distance. And yet, somewhere along the way, I had mistaken detachment for control. The realization did not carry regret. It carried acceptance. Daniel entered quietly, pausing when he saw me seated alone. "I can come back later," he said. "No," I replied. "It's fine." He stepped inside, standing a respectful distance away. I wanted to confirm the schedule for Thursday. We reviewed the details efficiently. When we finished, neither of us moved to leave immediately. The pause felt natural, unforced. "There's something I wanted to say," he began, then stopped. I waited, not pressing. He exhaled softly. "I appreciate the way things have been handled recently." I met his gaze calmly. "So do I." The exchange was brief, measured. No explanation followed. None was needed. When he left, I remained seated, aware that something had quietly concluded, not a chapter of events, but a phase of perception. The rest of the week unfolded without incident. Meetings progressed, decisions were made, responsibilities fulfilled, and throughout it all, I felt a steadiness I had not known before. On Friday evening, as the office began to empty, I gathered my things with deliberate care. Daniel finished a call and stood, slipping his jacket over his arm. "Have a good weekend," he said. "You as well," I replied. He hesitated, then added, "Thank you." "For what?" "For the space," he replied simply. I nodded. "It goes both ways." He smiled faintly and left. I stood by the window for a few moments after he was gone, watching the city settle into evening. The streets below glowed with movement, people heading home, lights flickering on, life continuing in patterns both predictable and deeply personal. I felt no urge to follow any particular thought to its conclusion. No need to define what had passed or what lay ahead. What remained was enough. That weekend, I spent more time than usual in quiet reflection. Not introspection in the anxious sense, but a gentle review of how my understanding had evolved. I realized that growth did not always arrive through confrontation or change. Sometimes it arrived through recognition of another's autonomy, of one's own limitations, of the value of allowing things to exist without interference. By Monday, the sense of clarity had settled fully. Daniel and I resumed our work without ceremony. The dynamic was familiar, yet refined. There was no tension to resolve, no curiosity left unanswered. Only mutual regard, shaped by experience rather than expectation. At one point, as we reviewed a proposal together, I noticed how comfortable the silence felt. Not empty, not strained, simply present. I understood then that acceptance was not passive. It was active restraint, the choice to honor what is without reshaping it to fit personal narrative. As the day drew to a close, I felt grounded in a way that extended beyond the office walls. The balance I had found here echoed into other parts of my life, influencing how I listened, how I waited, how I allowed moments to unfold. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No declarations had been made, and yet something meaningful had been resolved. The story we shared was not one of transformation through action, but through awareness, through the quiet acknowledgement that some connections are defined not by closeness, but by clarity. And in that clarity, I found peace. There is a comfort that arrives when a rhythm proves it can hold, not because it resists disruption, but because it absorbs it without breaking. I noticed that comfort settling in during the weeks that followed, subtle and steady, woven into the ordinary fabric of my days. Nothing outward had changed. The office remained the same. The work continued with familiar precision. Daniel fulfilled his role with the same quiet competence that had always defined him. And yet the way I experienced those days had shifted into something more grounded. I no longer anticipated moments. I no longer measured interactions for meaning. I allowed them to arrive and pass without commentary. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly projections, I paused mid-sentence, struck by how calm I felt. The figures were demanding, the stakes considerable, but my mind was unburdened. The clarity I had reached did not dull my awareness, it sharpened it. Daniel noticed the pause. "Would you like me to run alternate scenarios?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "That would be helpful." He nodded and began immediately, fingers moving across the keyboard with quiet confidence. I watched briefly, not with scrutiny, but with appreciation. It occurred to me then how rarely we acknowledge stability because it lacks drama. Yet stability, when earned rather than imposed, is one of the most profound states a person can reach. As the afternoon waned, the office grew quieter. Conversations tapered off. Footsteps softened. Lights dimmed in distant rooms. I stood and moved toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the glass. Below, the city unfolded in muted motion. Cars eased through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets with unhurried purpose. The world did not rush. It simply moved forward. Daniel finished his analysis and stood. "I'll send these shortly," he said. "Thank you." He hesitated briefly, then added, "I'll be out tomorrow morning. Personal appointment." "Of course," I replied. "Take the time you need." The exchange carried no weight beyond acknowledgement. And that, I realized, was precisely the point. The next morning, his absence registered only in the quiet order he had left behind. The schedule ran smoothly. Tasks progressed without interruption. I felt no disruption, no unease, only confirmation that autonomy, when respected, strengthens rather than weakens a system. When he returned later that day, he resumed his work without comment. Our greeting was brief, professional, and entirely sufficient. That evening, As I gathered my things, I reflected on how often people believe meaning must be demonstrated through intensity, through visible shifts, decisive actions, or spoken declarations. Yet here, meaning had revealed itself through continuity, through the steady affirmation that nothing needed to be corrected. Over the following days, I found myself carrying this understanding beyond the office. In conversations with colleagues, I listened more carefully. In moments of silence, I resisted the urge to fill them. In decisions, I trusted clarity over control. One evening, while organizing papers at my desk, I came across an old note, something Daniel had prepared years earlier. Concise, thoughtful, unobtrusive. I smiled faintly, not at the memory itself, but at how differently I understood it now. I placed the note back where it belonged and closed the file. The past did not require reinterpretation. It had simply gained context. As the week drew to a close, the office prepared for a long weekend. Conversations drifted toward plans, travel, rest. Daniel mentioned none of his. I did not ask. We had learned the value of not intruding where invitation had not been offered. On Friday afternoon, as he prepared to leave, he paused at my doorway. "I'll see you Tuesday," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was no added sentiment, no hesitation, just mutual acknowledgement of continuity. After he left, I remained seated for a while, listening to the building settle, the hum of systems, the distant closing of doors, the gradual quiet that followed a week well lived. I felt no sense of ending, only completion. The clarity I had reached did not feel final, nor did it need to be. It was not a conclusion, but a posture, a way of standing in the world without leaning too heavily on expectation. Some relationships, I had learned, are not meant to evolve into something else. They are meant to deepen into themselves, to shed illusion, to retain respect, to exist without strain. And in allowing that truth to settle, I felt a rare kind of gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what had been understood. As I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, the space felt familiar, grounded, complete. The rhythm held, and that was enough. There is a particular stillness that follows understanding, not the kind that empties a room, but the kind that settles into it like air finally at rest. I felt it most clearly on an ordinary morning, one that carried no significance beyond the fact that it arrived exactly as it should. The office lights came on at their usual time. The building woke slowly. Coffee brewed somewhere down the hall. The city outside moved with its familiar indifference. Nothing announced itself as important, and yet everything felt aligned. Daniel arrived at 8:30, not early, not late, precisely when he always did. He took his seat, set his notebook beside the keyboard, adjusted the monitor to its careful angle. The mug was different this time, plain, ceramic, no message printed across it. I noticed, and then I didn't. Some details matter only until they don't. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied. The exchange held no residue of the past weeks, no unspoken tension, no lingering curiosity. It was clean, honest, complete. We worked. Meetings came and went. Decisions were made. Problems were addressed with the same calm efficiency that had always defined our professional rhythm. If there was a difference, it existed beneath the surface, a subtle confidence that no longer required guarding. At one point, mid-morning, I found myself watching the reflection in the glass wall of my office. Not for vanity, but for recognition. I looked like myself again. Not the version built entirely from discipline and defense, but the one that had existed before I learned to equate distance with strength. That version felt quieter, more precise. At lunch, Daniel stepped out. I remained. There was work to finish, and for once, I didn't resent the solitude. Solitude had stopped feeling like absence. It felt intentional now. When he returned, he placed a document on my desk. "These are finalized," he said. "Let me know if you'd like revisions." "They're right." He nodded, accepting the statement without false modesty. Competence did not require apology. Later that afternoon, the board called unexpectedly. A minor complication, easily resolved. As I spoke, I realized how steady my voice sounded. Not controlled, assured. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. Daniel was already making notes. "I'll adjust the projections," he said. "Thank you." That was all. By early evening, the office thinned out. I watched employees leave in small groups, coats pulled on, conversations drifting toward plans that had nothing to do with work. Daniel remained until everything was in order, just as he always had. At 5:30 he stood. "I'm heading out," he said. There was no pause this time, no moment charged with implication. Just a door opening, a bag lifted, a routine honored. Before he turned the handle, he stopped. "Claire." I looked up. "I wanted to say," he began, then paused. Not uncertain, deliberate. "I appreciate the way things are." "So did I." "I do too," I said. He gave a small nod, satisfied, and left. The door closed softly behind him. I didn't sit in the silence afterward. I didn't replay conversations or search for meaning. I gathered my things, turned off the lights, and followed my own schedule out into the evening. Outside the air was cool. The city lights flickered on one by one, steady and unremarkable. I walked to my car without hurry, without the familiar weight of unfinished thoughts pressing in. Driving home, I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer measuring my life against what it lacked. I was simply living it. The house greeted me the same where it always had. Quiet, orderly, spacious. But it no longer felt empty. It felt like a place that belonged to someone who knew how to inhabit it. I poured a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window, watching the reflection of the city glow against the dark glass. There was no ache in my chest, no regret, just a calm awareness of balance restored. Some connections do not ask to be transformed. They ask to be respected. Some realizations do not demand action. They change you simply by being understood. And some chapters close not with resolution, but with peace. When I finally turned off the light and went upstairs, the quiet followed me, not as loneliness, but as space. Space to think, space to rest, space to continue. Tomorrow would come. Work would resume. So would I. Nothing had been lost. Nothing had been forced. What remained was enough. Some endings don't arrive with certainty. They don't close doors or announce new beginnings. They simply leave space where fear used to live. I once believed strength meant distance, that control was the same thing as safety. But control can become a wall, and walls keep more than pain out. They keep connection out too. What changed wasn't my life. It was the way I stood inside it. There are people who pass through your days quietly, doing exactly what they promised, asking for nothing more than honesty. Sometimes you don't notice their weight until the moment you almost let them go. Not every story ends with certainty. Some end with clarity. And sometimes that is enough to finally rest. Have you ever realized too late that keeping control was costing you something real? If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more slow burn psychological stories. New stories arrive regularly, quiet, reflective, and emotionally grounded. Stay connected and continue exploring the moments that change us without warning.